welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. This week's guest has just returned home to the UK from Syria, a country which holds a special place in his heart. He's a British artist and reportage illustrator, known for his drawings in situ in conflict zones, as well as areas affected by climate issues, humanitarian crises, and social issues. George Butler's poignant sketches from Yemen, Iraq, Myanmar, Ukraine, and other dangerous, volatile hotspots capture suffering, courage, and moments of hope. And they introduce us to some of the real people behind the headlines of global events who we rarely see. His drawings in pen, ink, and watercolour have won multiple awards, been displayed in prestigious places like Lambeth Palace, the V&A, and Imperial War Museums, and earned him the title The Paul Nash of Our Era from renowned author Michael Morpurgo. George draws in the most extraordinary places, from missile-scarred streets perched on rubble to nursing homes, vividly capturing stories of family, tragedy, perseverance, and resilience. And today I'm in the relative calm of George's studio in southeast London, Georgia. It's a privilege to be here, surrounded by some of your materials and work. How do you describe what you do?
You're very nice. It's chaotic in here, but I guess I just use drawing as a tool to tell people stories. And it has allowed me to be slow and sit down and listen to people. I think if I'd had a camera, I would have been diving around on the front line with other people, but I didn't. I just had a pen and a piece of paper. And so it demanded a sort of gentle kind of artist's interpretation, sort of human lens rather than a mechanical one of some of the places that you just mentioned.
So what exactly is reportage illustration then? Because in a way, I feel you've created this world. I've never heard of anybody who does quite what you do.
So reportage, there's a long history of it. I mean, I guess throughout time, we've used illustration and drawings to communicate with each other. 1842, probably the Illustrated London News is a kind of moment that it's kind of recognizable as a valued form of news recording. And it wasn't just because we hadn't invented cameras, it was because these were engaging ways of telling stories. And they're the things that we show our kids, they're the things that we have on our walls, and that counts for a lot. And throughout time, from the Egyptians back to the caves in Le Sceau in France, all the way back to those paintings recently found in Sulawesi 58,000 years ago, people have been using narrative images to tell stories. So this is not a new formula, but I think it's a dialect that we've forgotten how to use. I think we've become so obsessed with our phones and cameras and the immediacy of that news, the sort of passive absorption of it, that the illustration is just a sort of thing of the past. And why would we go backwards and be slow and analog? But I hope it's turning round. Who knows? You're
so much more eloquent than me, because I suppose that's what I meant, really. We turn on the news and everything's captured on TV cameras, or I've interviewed people like Giles Dooley, who I know that you know too, who captures humanitarian stories, but on a camera with a still lens. I'd never heard of anybody actually being in the heart of a conflict zone and being able to sit down and take that time to draw. I suppose you're in danger at some points, but do you find that it really helps your subject take that time? And when you're telling people stories, it's perhaps a softer, more gentle approach.
Yeah, I think all the good reporters and photographers like Giles and many others are, of course, equally well versed at getting subjects to relax and taking their time and doing their due diligence. For me, that's the way that I work. There's an element of that. I think the camera can put distance between people. I think it's expensive. It's usually black. The language around it is snap or capture or manipulate. These are kind of aggressive, fast, angular words. And drawing is the opposite of that. And perhaps they don't take you very seriously. They can see over your shoulder. Some child has probably picked up a pen and paper and drawing next to you, and everyone thinks that's hysterical. So there is a kind of relaxedness to it. But also, I'm not competing with those guys and girls that are trying to get stuff on the front page. These are the sort of feelings of events rather than the events themselves. Is how people tell their stories and how they feel about them, rather than what happened here yesterday morning at 6 o'clock and should it be on the 10 o'clock news.
Do you think in a way we've become desensitized to what's happening in this world where we don't seem to have much patience on social media? If it's not told in 30 seconds, we've lost our focus or concentration. I think the effect at looking at some of your work on me, these human stories are going on every day and have for hundreds of years in all kinds of conflicts. Yeah. But what draws you to tell those stories, George, and what draws you to those places where we'll talk about risk later, but sometimes you are in some difficult situations. You're absorbing these stories in your mind.
And that's what it feels like. I'm often asked sort of how I deal with the trauma, but the reality is it's much more hopeful than I think hopeless for me. And I think the process of sharing a drawing with someone and them sharing their story in return is, in a way, makes it feel safe. It's a kind of art therapy as I watch, I suppose. And it's my way of comprehending it. I know that I can show it to you. I know that I can share Olga's story or from Ukraine or others from Syria last week. So that makes it feel safe. Also, I get to see the human parts that I think the news lets us down on. Not the individuals, not the cameramen, not the camerawomen, but there is, you're right, isn't there, this sort of immediate, fast-flowing moment where people either skip by or turn off, or you have the January sales and then an image from Palestine, and then it flicks back to what you think you might want for lunch. There's some distance there, and this is really just my antidote to that.
In some ways, do you feel that perhaps you have a bit of a front row seat to humanity when you're out on location?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the human parts of the kind of loyalty and pride and fear and love and closeness of those moments are the bits that are overlooked. And the stories that I've been trying to focus on recently, and the ones I did in Ukraine the most, are not really sensational enough for the front pages, but they are very human moments from ordinary people, grandmas and kids and soldiers who I guess could have been overlooked, could so easily been forgotten by the news. And yeah, the words, in fact, their words became perhaps more powerful than the drawings, which I really enjoyed, actually.
We'll explore some of the characters that you've focused in a minute, but you are just back from Syria. Tell me about your special connection to Syria and its people.
I mean, this is fluke, really, but I guess it gives you an example. You get an idea of the attitude of Syrians from this, and that is that in 2012, I spent 3 or 4 days maybe recording across the border from Turkey. I walked from Turkey into this little town called Azaz. It was held by the Free Syrian Army. They asked me what I wanted to do, where did I want to go. They wanted to share their story with the world, which was, of course, their kind of fight against the Assad regime. And I went back 6 months later. And in the meantime, I didn't know at the time, but some friends had been fundraising for Syria. They'd been living there as well. And I felt such an affinity with some of the people I met that I got involved and we started a little charity. And I think people in the UK in particular wanted to give but didn't know how to give, and were they giving to the right people and was it safe? And we found that it was, and it was easy. And so we raised millions actually over the next 10 years. And that's why going back to Syria was so extraordinary just before Christmas, because we'd been fundraising Action Syria. We'd raised 9 million quid, but we'd never been allowed in the country because aid's been used as a very divisive weapon by the regime. And now we can go back. And so it was a sort of euphoric feeling. And it was wonderful to see everyone smiling and holding themselves high, and all those wonderful Syrian characteristics of being proud and loyal and looking forward to the future.
You said you started a little charity, and then I know that over a decade you raised more than £9 million, which is an extraordinary achievement. But this time, were you able to go back for the first time and see how some of that money you raised has benefited communities? How has it been used?
We know how it's been used because Rose Essam, who's the CEO, and I spend a lot of time monitoring it and checking that it's all being spent in the right way. But the answer to your question is we haven't been back to Afrin, which is where we've been sponsoring a primary health clinic. One of the projects that we support is in Lebanon, so we can see the education there. But I think what this means for Action Syria is to be able to operate in the country and raise money for the place that we think has got so much potential. 90% of people live below the poverty line. It's going to cost £500 billion to rebuild. There's no better time to be sending money back into Syria. They need it more than ever. And we just need to follow their lead. They believe it's going to happen, and we should too.
Tell me about the places you went to and the drawings that you did on this Syrian trip. A bit unusual for you. More of a good news trip, I suppose.
No, it was my perfect trip. This was a rare good news story and one that held the headlines quite rightly, but also the human stories that were coming out of Syria that week and still are now were the ones that haven't been told for, in some cases, more than a decade, but mostly from the war. The stories of the disappeared and the dead, and from Sednaya and from Duma. And it's very rare, I think, where people get to sort of tell their version of events. The Russians and presumably the Western world have become brilliant at misinformation. We don't quite know who to believe in the Middle East on any news front at the moment. And this time it was just the Syrian people standing on the street telling me and lots of other journalists what they saw and felt.
That must have been really moving, I would imagine, for you. And you were drawing, I think, celebrations, public funerals. You drawing all over the place, weren't you?
Yes, a couple of examples. First Friday prayers after the liberation, as it were, outside the Umayyad Mosque, looking back at the souk, the old gate, sort of crumbling gate, but with like hundreds of people standing on the top of it waving flags, and so busy that hardly anybody could move. It's a real euphoric moment, jubilance. And others all through the town that week, people coming up to me asking if I was an artist, and I would say yes, and then they would say, can you paint a flag on my face? And I would say, I'm not really that sort of artist, and they would just look at me completely confused. How I could be an artist, but I couldn't possibly carry out this one simple task. And I was having some flowers put on my drawing board and chocolate stuck in my pockets, and this one girl came up to me, she's called Lena, she's an English literature student, and she said, thank you so much for coming. Not me personally, but Europeans. We thought for so long that we were scary, and you thought that we were bad people, but actually we're just humans and we want to dance and we want to sing. And now that you're here, we know that you think that too. And that means a lot, because for so long we didn't know. And Arabic language allows these kind of mistranslations, but that was the feeling that week. No one deserves hope more than the Syrian people, I think.
What was it about the Syrian people that you felt such an affinity with?
I don't think it is the Syrian people, actually. I think it's just people. I've felt it all over the world, and that's definitely why I do my job. It just happened to be that I spent some time in Syria and I could see a way of helping the doctors and teachers that we did at Action Syria. It was a combination of the two, but that honesty and the kind of vulnerability in those moments to share is the bit that I think I find the most moving.
What in the first place, George, drew you to conflict zones and made you think, I think your first trip was Afghanistan, but made you think, this is what I want to do and this is what I want to do with my art?
I think the same answer. It's not in a sort of adrenaline rush for me, because I'm not trying to get to the front line necessarily. But I love that emotional connection with someone halfway around the world. It's often easy to feel quite solitary or lonely in a kind of pub in East London, where you think you're supposed to know these people are supposed to be similar. And yet you can get halfway around the world in Aleppo and sit on the street, as I did the other day, with a mechanic, and just feel so kind of close and absorbed. And I sat with this man who's called Abu Ahmed. He had a little workshop, and the odd thing about it was full of pigeons. And he said that he didn't really like people. He didn't want to talk to them anymore, so he just bought all these pigeons. Of course, as soon as he said that, I sat down and started drawing him, and the whole street was his friend, and they were talking to him, and he gave them cups of tea and pulled up chairs. And really what he was saying, which came out later, was that there's this sort of great sadness. He'd lost his son in a mortar attack, and he didn't realize he was comparing it to birds at the time, but he was saying, my son was my wings. He was the only person that could support me, and he was taken by the regime 10 years before. So it feels like those moments are the reason for drawing. The drawing is a kind of byproduct of it. I think I started drawing portraits because it meant that I got a little bit longer extra time to do an interview. Nobody really wants to get up and move. They feel too polite when you're making a portrait, and they want to see the end of it. But in the meantime, they're also talking.
And how do you deal with what you see? You touched earlier on that not many people ask you how you deal with that trauma, but you see sights that many of us will probably never see in a lifetime, and poverty and hardship, and you're at the cutting edge of the results of conflict, where people's lives and homes and businesses have been destroyed and they've lost people. How does George cope with that? What's your mechanism for being able to deal with that kind of sorrow, as well as the moments of joy that you've witnessed in Syria?
I think that they make it possible to see hope in it, and they are often very kind of caring of the story that they're telling me. But also the hardest part, I think, is wondering where they are now. And this trip in Syria was a reminder of that. People that I'd met 10 years before, and then little boys that I drew like Ahmed and Khalid, who lost their limbs or lost their parents. They're over 20 now, and I often wonder where they are. But the reaction, I think, for example, Action Syria has been a reaction to that. The feeling of being able to leave whenever you want because you've got the right passport and enough money in your pocket is one that all journalists have to deal with. I think as an artist, just doing right by their stories, often, I guess the secret kind of promise in my mind is that I'm going to share it with people who might want to listen. And so producing books and raising money and I guess being constantly in touch with people from half around the world, usually on WhatsApp or Telegram. Once you've sat down with someone and drawn them for an hour, it becomes almost impossible to kind of walk away and forget or ignore the next WhatsApp. So there's a kind of constant, I guess I carry them around with me, and I do that happily, but also there's sort of sadness in their stories, but not sadness in what I carry around.
It's such a beautiful story, George, because I'm a storyteller and I have been. I followed in my dad's footsteps. He was a journalist for 46 years and I've been a journalist since I was 17. But sitting here today in your studio in southeast London and listening to the stories that you're starting to tell and switching on the news and realizing all the different conflicts that are currently going on, makes me feel I don't really know the world. And I think you're much more in touch with the world. And I think the masses aren't in touch with what's going on. I suppose that goes back to being a bit desensitized, but I have great admiration for what you do and sort of wish I could tell those stories too. I would love to tell those stories. I'd probably be too fearful. I've never been to a war zone and I think I think
you could easily transfer the microphone and your questions to a place like that. And you'd be welcomed by them all. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the failings of the modern news industry is that it's so fast moving and it's measured by metrics and clicks and snaps and follows and tweets. And actually, the metric is not actually the target of what the news should be doing, which is about connection and a deeper understanding of the rest of the world. There is a bit of a failing, isn't there? Because we can't remember that we were outraged about Afghanistan and incredibly upset about Gaza and wanted to react to Ukraine. And now we're supposed to be happy for Syria, which is a place that we were supposed to be sad for a couple of weeks ago. So I mean, it is impossible for a single brain to keep any of it in. And I think that's really hard. I guess in a way, the lucky part for me is that I get to see the sad. So Syria, I get to see the sad parts and speak to people like Tawfiq. He had lost his wife, his brother and 4 kids in the chemical attack in Duma in 2018, which was this very kind of controversial moment. It incited American response, hitting 4 different missile sites across Syria. And I met him in the street writing notes on the back of a bonnet of a car. And he came up and told me this story and he showed me photographs and it was getting dark and it was an incredibly kind of moving moment. And then he invites me into his house. He makes a cup of tea. He's had 3 children with a different person since then because he said he can't bear the loneliness. Doesn't have anyone to fast with, doesn't have anyone to buy clothes for. But he's got this 2-year-old kid, 1-year-old kid called Judy sitting on his lap. And I draw them both. And so I get to see, I guess, I'm lucky and I get to see the happy parts too. And that's the hard part to transfer. You don't get that on the 10 o'clock news. You don't really even get it in the long read. But it's a movement that lots of people recognize. It's something that we recognize in ourselves. We're putting limits on our iPhones. We're trying to make sort of longer interactions with the news, but it's just very difficult to do.
One thing I'm still puzzled by is when you went to Afghanistan, I think you were still at university. What was that? There must have been some kind of moment or perhaps something from your childhood or something that made you think, I'm going to go to Afghanistan. Because most students, that probably wouldn't be at that tender stage of life necessarily be on their radar.
I know, it might become a therapy session. I think that it was a combination of drive to get out of education and knowing that there was something else in the world. A kind of quite stubborn pride that I was going to do something different, but I didn't know what it was. This kind of ultimate fascination with different, I guess, like sort of young male view of the world where you just sort of got to go and see it and walk around it and look at it and see what happens. And then I found the kind of perfect excuse for doing that, which happened to be a pen and ink and a piece of paper. And that's what I've tried to do ever since then, really. Prove that drawing is the thing and try and get it back in the newspapers.
Drawing is a thing, and I'm sitting here smiling because I'm looking at your new book, which is a moving collection of personal testimonies from the war in Ukraine. It's called Ukraine, Remember Also Me. I'm smiling because there's a bunch of carrots next to it, and I'm quite puzzled as to what the carrots are doing next to your book.
They're just their lunch, actually.
Well, their lunch.
With other things, but... Yeah, they look a bit odd there, don't they? I should have moved them.
Don't worry at all. But tell me, it's not embarrassing at all. It just made me smile. The therapy session's over now and you've uncrossed your arms again now, so that's okay. Tell us about the book and what the reader can expect from it.
The book, as normally happens, I sort of set out to make these drawings as an artist that I thought was artists are very precious about the next drawing. They want it to look good. They're terrified that it's going to look bad. And I thought that I could make some good drawings in Ukraine. So I set out to do that. But the more time I spent there and the more people I spoke to, I suddenly realized that this kind of interview process that we're going through at the moment was a first draft of kind of history in Ukraine at that time. It was also something that I didn't know very much about. It was also something I was sure that my friends didn't know much about in London. And so these stories of Olga and Vladimir and Sergei and Andrei poured onto the page, and then I tried to edit them into nice bite-sized captions for the people who might not have very much time, but the reality was they were impossible to edit. And so they stayed in their original format, which is just their own words transcribed. There's this girl called Nata who we interviewed about Mariupol, and she provided pages and pages of testimony. And I sat with the publisher, Denise, brilliant at Walker Books, and we tried to edit it, and it just became too difficult. And one story about when she was reading it to me, actually, this gives an idea of why people might speak to journalists or why they might share their stories. But she'd written it all out and she was reading it in Ukrainian, and that was being translated by my friend Roman to me in English. And I'd already read it, and halfway through it was getting to these quite sad moments about how her mother-in-law had died underground with her, whether they were going to make it out at all. She had a 14-year-old son with her. And I said to her, would you like to stop the interview? Because I've read it and I know what's coming. I'm not going to not publish it just because you haven't read it. And she looked at me as if I'd mortally offended and just said, I'm going to read every word to you. I want you to hear it from me and understand what it was like. And she continued reading it line for line, just so that she could say it out loud.
And you can't edit something like that. I mean, what on earth would you take out if somebody's bared their soul?
We tried. We tried. And there was another man called Sergei who said, you can publish my story. He's a very funny man. You can publish my story, but you have to spell Russia with a small R the whole way through the testimony. And of course, the copy editor in Vauxhall was just like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? A non-capitalized letter at the beginning of the sentence. And you did it, didn't you? We did it only for his story, yeah, not for the whole book.
Tell me about some of these characters. I feel like I sort of know them because when I was doing my research and watching something that you did actually in Washington, you talked about people like, for example, Madame Olga. Who was Madame Olga?
So Olga kicks the book off, I guess, because it was just sort of her humanity that I felt really encapsulated what was happening in Ukraine at the time. She was 99. She was born in 1923. She survived the Holodomor. She was taken to a collective farm by her father. These are all moments from history books in between the First and Second World War that we might have learnt about. She lived them. And then she was a slave for a Nazi family outside Dresden. She survived the British bombardment of that. And when the war came, when she was liberated by Soviet forces, she walked home, led 150 cows home, met her husband, Petro, got married, had 4 children, lived another 80 years. And this was delivered by this tiny bird-like figure wrapped up in a blanket in the 4th floor apartment in Kyiv. She couldn't get out of bed when the air raid sirens went off. Her daughter was 79, Valentina. She was standing next to us. And yeah, I sat and drew, and my friend Oliver Marsden sort of sat and filmed. And we both were just completely in awe of this person, and made more poignant. A couple of months later, she died just before her 100th birthday. So suddenly there is like purpose to sitting with a pen and a paper. And I think that was one of those moments. And then so I guess the book just went from there, really. Once she'd set it up, it became a bit like, I don't know if you've ever read some of the Svetlana Alexievich stuff, The Unwomanly Face of War or The Boys in Zinc. These are personal testimonies of people at a particular time, and they really count for something.
It's the people that really stand out for me. And I've written Fixer Dzvinka, I hope I pronounced that. And then I've put brackets, tidying books.
Yes, yeah.
Bring that one to life for me.
Yeah, and then, so that is a man called Petro. There was this missile strike in Kramatorsk, 8 a.m. in the morning. It burnt the front of a building off. Everything's covered in soot. All the belongings are lying on the floor. This is just a residential block. So you can see, you've seen the photographs, the kind of chandelier still swinging like 3 floors up, but there's no wall and the kitchen's lying on the floor. And I drew that scene. I collected some bits of rubbish and stuck them on the page. And Zvinka had obviously got bored and walked around the corner. And she was talking to this old man. And he was called Petro. He was 70. He'd come past that day and he'd found a pile of books that had been, someone's library had been blown out of the window. Perhaps they'd been stacked in the window to block up from the bombing. And he'd just taken it upon himself to stack them in little piles because he thought that was the right thing to do. This sort of chaos at the front where news teams are trying to interview everyone. And he was just quietly stacking these books, this very grandfatherly, gentle character. And then as soon as I'd sort of started drawing, as soon as we'd started asking him questions, he said, no, I'm just normal. I don't want to talk to you journalists. I just want to go. So he sort of potted off and that was it. That then became a kind of decision to try and record as many of these stories as possible. It's often easy to find a young man holding a Kalashnikov standing at a checkpoint who wants to talk. There's thousands of those stories. But it's the ones like Petro and Olga and others, those who don't think they've done anything abnormal. They don't want to be recognised. They don't want to be heroes. They just want it to go back to how it was before. Those are much more difficult to find.
You're holding the book at the minute. When you reflect on the book, who else are the characters that really stand out? You paint the picture with words so beautifully as well as your art.
I mean, all of them. I spoke actually yesterday to a school in Kyiv on Zoom, and the lady in the back of this book, Larissa, is a headmistress. She was on the call and she'd stayed behind in the school in Saltivka, which is in the north of Kyiv, was heavily bombed. And she just kept it open because they had a basement and people were living there. And she saw it as her duty to do. Lots of young men were living there because their grandparents didn't want to leave their flats. So they lived underground and they would go back in the day to help out. My feeling was that everybody should have left except she had stayed. And then her husband was like, fine, if you're going to stay, I obviously have to stay with you. And her son sort of said the same. So they were all just stuck to this kind of matriarchal figure. And she rebuilt the school and I saw her yesterday. And so it was nice to know that everyone's still okay. And then there were others like Artem.
I've written Artem brackets jellyfish museums.
Yes, and that is, don't
I
sound
wrote
so
this a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
I actually wrote this before you went to Syria because we had a date in our diary, didn't we? And then on the day you got sent to Syria. So that's why I can't remember why I've written jellyfish museum next to Artem's name.
So Artem, it's not a mistake. When I went back to Ukraine, I texted a lot of my journalist friends saying, are there any good stories that you haven't been able to write about? And a friend called Izzy Coles, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, had said, yes, there's one. My editor didn't think that the Jellyfish Museum in Kramatorsk in Kyiv was newsworthy enough. So I got to interview Artem. He looked like the sort of man you might see at a football stadium somewhere, shaved head, puffer jacket, not really giving much warmth off in our first interaction. And then yet I got him talking about jellyfish, which is his subject. He sort of opened up and was so gentle and talked about them. And his wife lives in Wales and he was looking forward to seeing her. And she was jealous of the jellyfish because she spent too long looking after them. And it was his story of trying to keep a place open during the war. The one place that he thought that Ukrainians could go because, to get away from some of the destruction. And of course, it seems silly to value a museum at a time of war, but this was his way of trying to keep some normality. And every time the electricity went off, they would start dying and he would have to get new jellyfish in. So it's a sort of great struggle.
Did he manage to keep it open?
Yes, it is still open as far as I know. And it is, it's underground. It's kind of, he made the price very cheap so everybody could come in. And he just spoke so brilliantly about these sort of blobs floating around in glass tanks, how they'd been around for 500 million years. And there was a real kind of constant. And I think people often turn to books and trees and gardens and animals and jellyfish in this case. And in fact, there are lots of stories in the book about animals. I don't know if you remember the news. It was full of pets coming out across the borders into Poland. And I think that was one of the great kind of ways in which the Ukrainians could visually explain that they were different from the way they saw the Russians. In their mind, they had a great dignity. They wanted to look after strangers. They wanted to look after me. They wanted to look after their pets, which was comparison to the Russian army that couldn't even look after its own young men. And so this is the difference between us and them. And that played out on the front pages, dogs and cats on trains and in bags. And it was also a very clever way of relating themselves to us.
I think also what you were saying about the jellyfish man. Reminds me a bit of the chap tidying the books. I suppose when there's chaos and the heartache of war all around, I suppose some of the people you're interviewing are looking for that normal, aren't they? And that perhaps involves looking after their pets
definitely.
as well.
Something has to continue, routine or communication or something that can relate you to what you had before or might get you out of the situation you're in. And I think drawing is very good at picking up on those more common human experiences. They're not front page news, I realise that, but they are a more common regularity in those in war zones. Soldiers having cups of tea, people
stories.
waiting around.
I mean, they're the real stories we don't really see. I'm looking at pieces of your work all around us, and I'm wondering, when you sit down and you start drawing or painting, what materials do you use? How do you choose whether that's a pen and ink drawing or whether you're going to get the watercolours out? What's the process like,
question.
George? You might not even have an answer for that because I bet it comes so naturally to you.
No, it doesn't. It's almost always pen and ink on location. I'm trying to do as much of it as possible. I work on an A2 board with an old dip pen and ink, and there's a kind of immediacy there that really helps. I don't want to use pencil too much because I know that I'm going to try and rub it out and change it. And a bit like speaking a language, you just kind of got to say it all out loud and someone will understand it. It doesn't matter if you make a mistake along the way. And so, but the most important part, I think, is to start the drawing and spend an hour or two, as long as the situation allows, from life, so that you get this kind of sense of movement and fluidity and composition. And then the tone or the watercolour I'll often do afterwards, just because it takes time.
Sometimes while you're in the country, or do you sometimes work on the pieces here at the studio too?
Yeah, ideally, I'm best when I'm doing it like later that day and it kind of comes back to my mind. But I also take photographs. There's also an element like when you write a long essay, it's quite nice to leave it for a few days and come back and suddenly you can see all these glaring mistakes. So yeah, as you can see, there's piles of drawing from Angola and Tanzania and Iraq that all need things that I think need doing to them, but whether I ever get to them or not.
Tell me about the picture I'm looking at, the framed picture on the wall of the tanks. What was the story? Where were you there?
That's in Ukraine as well. It was a facility in the sort of suburbs of Kyiv, this secret place. We weren't allowed to take photographs of it. We weren't allowed to really know where it was, but we did know where it was. But we were picked up in a car park by these two press officers and taken into this enormous facility. Everything was covered over. Even the sort of doors between buildings were covered so no one could see what was happening. And they were fixing tanks and armoured personnel carriers. And the ones in the drawing are Russian tanks that they're proudly repurposing to go back to fight against the Russians. And it was freezing cold. And all the work stopped at about 4:00 because they didn't want to put the lights on in case they were being watched from space. And then inside, and in the book I talk about it, these very ordinary people. I think he was called Anatoly. He was 50. He said, I used to be fixing other things and now I've been doing this for a year. I can't wait for it to be over. Those are the moments I'm looking for.
Drawing gives you that real freedom in terms of where you actually conduct your drawing or where you sit. And you sit in some extraordinary places. Sometimes you're on wreckage or whatever. Tell me a bit about some of the other places in the world. You mentioned Iraq, Angola, where you've been, and any memories. You must have so many memories, but any memories that really stand out of you being in an extraordinary situation, drawing, but right in the heart. I bet there's lots, actually.
Queuing up in there, yeah. Careful. Okay, I'll give you two. I was drawing in Tanzania before Christmas and working with an organisation called the Wilderness Project. They are biodiversity surveys of all the rivers in Africa, which have never really been measured and never really been recorded. So this is like really valuable work. But the only way to do it is to basically paddle up and down them, like a sort of geography field trip. And I got to go along with them and make drawings. But one of those trips in Tanzania was with the Hazda tribe community. They're the sort of hunter-gatherers of the world as we imagine them. And they are a complete antidote to everything we know about the world. They don't really have belongings. They don't really deal in currency except to buy cigarettes. They don't have homes. They don't have any real understanding of time, how we would see it. And their language is an isolate, which means it's not spoken by anybody else and theirs doesn't derive from anywhere. And they wake up in the morning and they go hunting if they want something with a bow and arrow, with a poison tip. And one of the things that they also do is they interact with the honeyguide bird, which is, you may have seen on the BBC, they whistle for the bird and the bird comes and shows them where the honey is and they leave some for it. And I thought this was sort of quite gimmicky. Maybe it was like a sort of display thing that the BBC have made the most of. But wherever they're walking every day, they go and they interact with this bird, and it shows them where the honey is, or they show it where the honey is. And I got to watch and try and draw this moment, which is kind of as old as time. And they climb the tree with an axe, and they light a fire and smoke the bees out, stick their hand in and bring out this honey. And 10% of their diet is honey. And it was totally kind of mesmerizing to be allowed to watch it and try and draw it, which I did not in any way do service to it, but I got to draw the people and these enormous baobab trees that it happens in. So that was not a sad event. And I don't think reportage is specific to sad things, but yeah, I still feel quite, I don't know what I feel. I just would love to go back and do more of that sort of thing.
And could you go back? I mean, were they very welcoming?
Yeah, I think I could turn up tomorrow and sort of sit down next to the fire with them, and they would just sort of nod and just say hello, as if there isn't this great kind of society, very different. You sort of come and go, and there isn't this kind of formality that we have to it, but it just feels very ordinary. I would not necessarily to be with them, but I would like to make more drawings of the natural world. And this is a sort of Garden of Eden territory versus some of the other stuff we've talked about, which is the kind of worst and best of humanity. So it's like great destruction versus some of the things that we should be focusing on.
Yeah, because it isn't just conflict zones you go to. I mean, we mentioned in the introduction, climate change stories you've covered. It's just real authentic stories, isn't it? It's just that I suppose most of the ones that have come across my radar are from the conflict zones.
Yeah, like I guess the scary ones get the most attentions. But yeah, some of the ones in Tanzania and Angola were very moving for me. I drew in a leprosy clinic in Nepal with a man called Donald Summit. He was operating on people's hands, try and fix them, give them more opposability. This is a disease that we think is from medieval times, but exists very much in Nepal and in India. And I just got to stand in the corner of the operating theatre whilst the sort of great Western medicine minds operated on this kind of medieval illness. And that was also, in a way, a kind of very happy place. The results of those operations are very positive. So yeah, it can be anything.
You're uncovering stories that people just don't really hear. So how do you get those stories across now? For example, with the leprosy story and with the bees and the honey and this extraordinary tribe.
Question.
Where can we see that work? Where can we read about what you're doing?
Other than doing podcasts in my studio. So the Wilderness Project stuff is ongoing. I've been working with them for about 3 or 4 years. Most of the work you can see in my studio, as they will remind me, is not finished and should be. But we're going to have an exhibition. We're going to try and raise some money for the work that they're doing. And so that will surface at some point. I think there are loads of stories that I've done that never got to the surface in Armenia and in Yemen and in Nepal. Sometimes I just can't get them in a newspaper. It's difficult to get a book published at the moment. And they sit in a brown folder in my studio until I get to talk about them. But,
so I'm happy that you're doing the podcast. And your work has been displayed at prestigious places. What's it like, for example, seeing your work on the walls at somewhere like the V&A, which is probably one of my favourite haunts?
It's very validating because you actually think that you're never going to be allowed in there anyway. So the work in the V&A is actually in the archive from Syria and from Ukraine. So it has to be in there forever, which is nice. And sometimes the sad, like the really sad ones, there's a drawing somewhere here of the mass graves in Ukraine. They feel like they should be in a place like that where they can be seen and on record, a kind of official record. Yeah, that I think is a great place for them. And yeah, also in the National Army Museum as well, but I don't know, not sure.
It's a great achievement. And I would imagine the first time somebody like that called or got in touch, or you got in touch and they said, yes, please, it was quite validating and quite perhaps a special moment, is it?
I think so, yeah, because all creative people know this, and maybe it's the same for journalists as well. It's quite a solitary path. You've kind of got to drive it forward yourself, and normally the phone doesn't ring, and you hope it does one day. The point of reportage, which is slightly different from location drawing or urban sketching or making pictures at home, is that it's only really as good as the people who see it. So I don't really feel like I've done my job until I think people see it.
And have you always been able to draw, George? Was it something that you were good at as a child?
I did it a lot as a child. I think I was good as a child. My mum is an artist, so she had an art group twice a week at home. So I witnessed what it was to be an artist, which I think counted for a lot. But I hesitate because I also think that you can learn to draw. And I think that the education system in this country and also around the world gives no value on creativity, really. And creativity doesn't mean you have to pick up a HP pencil and copy a bird from a book. It means, I don't know, rhythm or colour or timing or language. These are all different ways of being creative. I think if we spent as much time doing drawing, for example, as we did maths or English, that we would all have an ability to do it. And the annoying thing is that most people say, when I was 12, my teacher told me I couldn't do it, so I never tried. I never did art or music ever again.
I wanted for 2 hours on the night. I never forget, my mum and dad were locking the front door. I was about 14. I was going to school to choose my options. And they said, oh, what do you want to be? Now, all my life, I've only wanted to be a journalist. And that night I said, I don't know, maybe a doctor. And A, I wasn't bright enough. B, I didn't want to be a doctor. And C, we went to school and my mum and dad proudly told all my teachers that I want to be a doctor. And then they said, what would you like to study? And I said, I definitely want to do art. And they, oh no, you can't do art if you want to be a doctor. So I did chemistry, physics, biology and human biology and all that kind of thing, and was a journalist and should have done art.
It's in our society, from a money-making point of view, that probably is the right decision, but I think it's taken all too lightly, and usually, as you say, on a kind of Wednesday evening when you have to decide in the morning what your GCSEs are going to be. So yeah, there's so many stories like that.
My daughter, I'm proud to say, she's studying economics at university, but 2 of her A-levels were maths and art. And
Great.
Now she's going into the big wide world seeking a job. A company said to her the other day, we're absolutely thrilled to see art A-level on there. And, along with the financial brain that she has.
It must still be quite a rare thing, but I'm glad that.
Yeah, and I'm glad she did that. Paul Nash, I mentioned as well in the intro, was a surrealist painter and war artist, and perhaps I think seen as one of the most important landscape artists of the first half of the 20th century. How did you feel when Michael Morpurgo described you as the Paul Nash of our era, and how did that come about?
Yeah, full disclosure, because I've illustrated 2 books for Michael, and he's also an incredibly generous, kind man. I think he made that comparison because of some of the drawings that Paul did in the war and that I have done. I guess, I don't know whether I'm following in his footsteps, but certainly I imagine the history of this sort of lies with people like Henry Moore and Neveson and Paul Nash and Sargent, all of whom are wrapped up in the Imperial War Museum. But it's other illustrators really that inspire me, I think, more than Nash's work.
I feel you're treading your own path, but inspired by other people as well. I think you've talked about being inspired by, aren't we all, Sir Don McCullin and people like that, an incredible war photographer. But it feels to me, just knowing you a tiny bit through liaising on the podcast, I think you're treading your own path, George. And that's a wonderful thing to do. I think you're telling stories in a very different way, and you've got your own style and your own way of doing it.
Thanks very much. I hope
I'm embarrassed now.
I can't see that on the radio.
All these powerful portraits of war and conflict are really a timely reminder of the humanity that we all share and our universal need and hopefully desire for peace. Do you sleep easy at night, George? How worried are you about the world we live in? Because I'll be honest, I've been a journalist a long time, 4 decades now, and I don't think I've really felt ever as concerned about the place that the world finds itself in right now. And I just wondered how you felt, whether you feel disturbed by that.
Yeah, I think you can't not be disturbed by it. I think it's terrifying what the damage that could be done within the next 50 years, especially from a climate point of view, but also the wars that seem to be popping up even more and more regularly, which I think will only continue as population increases and resources get, we have a finite resource, and those are the kind of realities of the situation that we're in. And that's really scary. I don't really know what the answer is. I think the drawing is probably a way of me trying to contribute to that, because it's so easy, isn't it, to feel helpless in the face of climate. We know that we should be recycling, but it's probably not going to be enough. We know that we shouldn't be flying, but no one else seems to be stopping. So these are the kind of really difficult everyday decisions. And I think drawing is my way of contributing a little bit more.
And getting those stories out there so that people can hear, and I hope people will go out and buy your book and take some time to sit down and read those stories and perhaps understand the stories behind the news, or the stories that the news doesn't share with us. I think what you're doing is quite extraordinary. What does the rest of 2025 hold for you in terms of travel?
I think just on the book and also on the things in Syria, I think that there's so much good as well. And that's really the takeaway from this work. There are a lot of good people doing a lot of good things. We need to give them the space to do it. And that's what I hope for in Syria, because I think it's so easy to be cynical. It's become habitual to be downbeat about Syria. And yet if you were there, as I was last week and before Christmas, and I will be next week, there's lots of good people doing good things. And so let's not, as the media or as sort of people from far away, talk down about it too quickly. I think we have a responsibility to do that. So that's what the book's about. And then next week, to answer your question, I am going back to Syria to continue this work, doing some commissions for various different news organisations, The Independent, there'll be something in the Telegraph, and anybody else who I can get to listen.
And any other travels planned already this year?
I'm trying to go back to Angola with the Wilderness Project. I want to do a story about the bushmeat trade there, which is alive and well and legal and operates within a sort of community level. It's understandable. It can be justified. This is like a way of sustaining. Also sort of got an encroachment from the outside world and poachers and Chinese railways. And I guess this is sort of the forefront of some of the things we're talking about, that balance between taking advantage of the natural world versus sort of living off it and coexisting with it. So I'd like to do that. And if I get to do half of any of these things, then that'll be a good year.
What is, she says rather naively, what do you mean by the bush meat trade? Is it people using wildlife to live on because they need...
Yeah. So in Angola, you've got an area the size of England, which is sort of pristine wilderness, protected in some ways by the war there for 40 years. And you've got a very light population of people, and they live off the Sitatunga and the Daika and the animals that live in the forest there, the Miombo forest. And that's very sustainable and actually is quite a healthy relationship. But when you get sort of outside markets having an interest in it, then suddenly you get this trade where they're just killing meat, which doesn't go to the village or the town. It goes to the Congo or on a train to the coast. And then suddenly there are these pressures which are sort of turned up, and then deforestation starts, and then they try and sort of hunt through burning down the forest instead of just with bow and arrows. This is, I should say, what we all did to our countries over the last 1,000 years. It's just that Angola has been preserved in a certain way until now. So we mustn't be judgmental, but it's happening. And I think it's important to look in upon. And the stories would be the same stories. Who are these people? Why would they not wake up in the morning and try and look after their families? And yet, how does anyone try and influence what they do and for some coexistence of the planet or the biosphere?
I hope you get there. And I'm following you now on Instagram and everything else, so I will keep in touch and hopefully find out what you're up to. And it's been really lovely to come to your studio. I always feel quite privileged if I'm in an artist's studio.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming. No one ever comes down the Old Kent Road.
The Old Kent Road. I like the Old Kent Road. I've immersed myself in your work.
Just the brown one on the Monopoly board. That's all people know.
I know. When today I came by tube and then just for the last bit of the journey hopped in a cab, and he said, "Hey love, when you leave, do you want to walk up the Old Kent Road?" And I'm like, "Wasn't that on my Monopoly board?" I think getting to a location, I always want to make sure I'm on time, but going back, then I'll hop on the bus and I'll be up the Old Kent Road.
Yeah, you can go past Millwall Football Club, the recycling centre.
I've been by Millwall Football Club. He explained that. Wasn't the Old Kent Road? I think I used to buy those on Monopoly when I was a kid. Aren't they the brown ones at the beginning of the board? The cheaper properties rather than the ones further around the board.
They were the cheap ones, yeah.
This doesn't feel cheap to me. We're in an amazing studio. And I just wanted to say a massive thank you to Nick from Herbert Hall Winery, who was a guest on the podcast, who out of the blue sent me a message and said, "I've just met somebody who I think should feature on the Convex Conversation." So if you're listening to this, Nick, you are absolutely right. George has been a brilliant guest, and thank you for having me. And it's been lovely to have a cup of tea with you, and I'm still smiling at you carrots.
Thanks for coming down. You can take some with you.
Oh, thank you very much. You've been listening to illustrator George Butler, capturing ordinary people in extraordinary times in pencil, watercolour and ink. And to find out more about George's inspirational work and his new book, check out his website, georgebutler.org, or follow him on Instagram at georgebutlerillustration. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com, and do join me next week for another inspirational guest.